The laughter follows me even after I've walked far enough that I can no longer see the orange glow of the bonfire. It drifts through the trees like smoke, clinging to the air, reminding me of everything I've just left behind. My friends are still there, passing bottles and telling stories that grow louder and more exaggerated with each telling. Zachary is probably doing his impression of Professor Martinez again, the one where he mimics her accent and gets everyone to laugh until their sides hurt. Miles will be trying to convince some girl from our biology class that he's deeper than he actually is, quoting poetry he half remembers from high school. I used to find comfort in their noise. It was easier to disappear into the sound of other people living their lives, to let their energy carry me along like a current. But tonight, sitting on that fallen log with a beer growing warm in my hands, I felt like I was suffocating. Every joke landed wrong. Every burst of laughter felt too bright, too forced. I kept catching myself staring into the fire, watching the flames devour the wood, thinking about how quickly something solid could turn to ash and smoke. The woods accept me differently than my friends do. Here, there's no expectation to perform, no pressure to be the version of myself that fits neatly into their world. My footsteps crack against fallen leaves, and somewhere above me, branches sway with a sound like whispered secrets. I tell myself I'm just taking a walk, that I'll circle back once I've cleared my head. But with each step, the distance between me and that warm circle of light grows wider, and I find myself reluctant to turn around. The trail I thought I knew curves and directions I don't remember. Pine trees tower overhead, their tops lost in darkness, and the familiar landmarks I was counting on have melted away into shadow. I pull out my phone, the screens glow harsh against my face, but there are no bars of signal. Just a blank digital void where connection should be. My breath comes shorter now, not from exertion, but from something colder settling in my chest. I've been walking for 20 minutes, maybe 30, following what I thought was the path we took earlier. But everything looks the same in the dark. Every cluster of birch trees could be the one from 10 minutes ago. Every small clearing could be the one I passed through, or an entirely new space altogether. I stop walking and listen. The bonfire's laughter has disappeared completely now, swallowed by distance and trees. In its place, there's only the soft rustle of wind through branches and the distant sound of water moving over rocks. My heart pounds against my ribs, and I force myself to breathe slowly, the way my mother taught me when I was small and afraid of thunderstorms. You're not actually lost, I tell myself. You're 21 years old. You grew up camping with your father. You know how to find your way back. But the words feel hollow, unconvincing. The truth is, I've felt lost for months now, maybe longer. Lost in my classes where I sit in the back row and take notes on environmental systems I'm supposed to care about but don't. Lost in my apartment, where Zachary and Miles plan their futures with a certainty I can't imagine possessing. Lost in phone calls with my parents, where I lie and tell them I'm doing fine, that I'm on track, that everything is exactly as it should be. The cold creeps through my jacket, and I zip it higher, tucking my hands into the pockets. October nights in these mountains drop temperature fast once the sun goes down. I should have thought of that before I walked away from the fire. I should have told someone where I was going. I should have done a lot of things differently. But I didn't, because the weight of their expectations had become unbearable. Zachary talking about the internship he'd landed for next summer, already mapping out his post-graduation career like it was a foregone conclusion. Miles discussing the girl he'd been seeing, how she fit perfectly into his 5-year plan. And me, sitting there with nothing to contribute except the growing certainty that I was failing at being the person they thought I was. I start walking again, choosing a direction that feels right even though I have no real way of knowing. The trees seem to press closer now, their branches reaching across the narrow path like arms trying to embrace or ensnare. I think about the stories my grandfather used to tell me about these woods, how they were old when his grandfather was young, how they had watched generations of people get turned around and find their way out again. Some of them, he would add with a wink that both thrilled and terrified my 8-year-old self, never found their way out at all. The path splits ahead of me, and I stand at the fork trying to remember if this was here before. One trail curves left toward what sounds like running water. The other disappears into a grove of pines so dense they block out even the faint starlight. I choose left, following the sound of the stream, reasoning that water always leads somewhere. But as I walk, the certainty I was building begins to crumble again. Nothing looks familiar. The trees are different here, older, with thick trunks scarred by decades of weather. The stream, when I finally reach it, is wider than I expected, moving fast enough that I can hear it rushing over rocks, even in the darkness. I've never seen this stream before. The realization hits me like cold water. I am genuinely lost, not just temporarily turned around or taken a long way back. Lost in a way that means I don't know where I am or how to get back to where I was. The kind of loss that makes headlines when they find someone 3 days later, hypothermic and dehydrated. My legs feel suddenly unsteady, and I sit down on a fallen log beside the stream. The water reflects what little light filters through the canopy, creating patterns that shift and dance like living things. I could follow the stream, I think. Streams lead to rivers, rivers lead to roads, roads lead to civilization. But which direction? And how far? The temperature is dropping steadily now. I can see my breath in small puffs of vapor, and my fingers are starting to go numb despite being buried in my jacket pockets. I think about my friends back at the bonfire, probably too caught up in their conversations to notice I'm gone yet. By the time they do, by the time they realize I've been missing for hours, it might be too late for them to find me in the dark. That's when I see the light. It's faint at first, barely distinguishable from the play of starlight on water. But as I stare, it grows steadier, more purposeful. A warm yellow glow moving between the trees on the far side of the stream. Not the harsh white of a phone's flashlight or the dancing orange of a campfire. Something softer, more deliberate. A lantern. The figure holding it emerges slowly from the darkness, resolving into the shape of a person moving with unhurried confidence through terrain that would have me stumbling and grasping for balance. Even in the dim light, I can tell he's taller than me, broader through the shoulders, moving with the easy grace of someone who belongs in these woods in a way I never will. He stops on the opposite bank of the stream and looks across at me. I can't make out his features clearly, but I can feel the weight of his attention, the way he's taking in my situation without judgment or alarm. There's something almost inevitable about his presence, as if the woods themselves had sent him to find me. He doesn't call out or ask if I'm okay, doesn't offer immediate reassurance or demand to know what I'm doing out here alone. Instead, he simply stands there, lantern light creating a circle of warmth around him, and waits. I should be relieved. I should be shouting across the water, explaining my situation, asking for directions back to the road. Instead, I find myself frozen, caught between gratitude and a strange, nameless fear. Because there's something about this stranger that feels like a crossroads, like a door I didn't know I was looking for suddenly opening in front of me. After what feels like an eternity, but is probably only seconds, he raises his free hand in a gesture that could be greeting or acknowledgement or something else entirely. Then he turns and begins walking upstream along the far bank, his lantern light bobbing gently with each step. He pauses after a few yards and looks back at me. The message is clear without words. Follow me. Every rational part of my brain screams warnings. Don't follow strangers into the woods. Don't trust someone you can't see clearly. Don't make your already dangerous situation worse by going deeper into unknown territory with an unknown person. But as I sit there on that fallen log, watching his light grow dimmer with distance, I realize that all my rational choices have led me here anyway. Following the familiar path that turned unfamiliar. Trusting my instincts that turn out to be wrong, depending on my phone that has no signal and my friends who don't know I'm missing. Maybe for once, the irrational choice is the one that will save me. I stand up, legs stiff from cold and sitting, and begin following the stranger's light along my side of the stream. The water runs too fast and deep here to cross safely, but I can see him moving parallel to my path, never getting too far ahead, never letting his light disappear completely. We walk like this for what feels like miles, but might only be minutes, time stretching and contracting in the darkness. My feet find purchase on rocks and roots I can barely see, guided by some instinct I didn't know I possessed. The sound of rushing water fills the space between us, but somehow his presence feels as real as if he were walking beside me. Finally, the stream narrows to something I might be able to cross. He stops and turns toward me, raising the lantern higher so I can see the rocks that form a rough bridge across the water. The crossing looks treacherous, slick with moss and spray, but he waits patiently as I test each step. The rocks are more stable than they appear, and I make it across with only one moment where my heart leaps into my throat and I windmill my arms for balance. When I reach the other side, he's standing close enough that I can finally see his face in the lantern light. He's older than me, but not by much. Mid-20s, maybe, with dark hair that curls slightly and eyes that reflect the lamplight like still water. There's something timeless about his features, as if he could be from any decade, any century. He wears a heavy coat that looks handmade, sturdy boots that have seen years of use, clothes that speak of a life lived differently than mine. Up close, his stillness is even more pronounced. He doesn't fidget or shift weight from foot to foot the way I do. Doesn't fill the silence with nervous chatter or explanations. He simply looks at me with an expression I can't quite read, taking in my situation with what might be concern or curiosity or something else entirely. When he finally speaks, his voice is lower than I expected, roughened by cold air and night. He asks if I'm lost, and I nod, not trusting my voice. He considers this for a moment, then turns and begins walking again. This time, I follow without hesitation. The path he takes is barely visible to me, but he moves along it with absolute certainty. We climb steadily now, moving away from the stream and deeper into the forest. My legs burn from the exertion, and my lungs work harder in the thin mountain air. But there's something hypnotic about following his light, about trusting someone else to know the way when I so clearly don't. I want to ask where we're going, how far it is, whether he has a phone with signal or knows how to get me back to the road. But something about his presence discourages questions, as if speaking would break whatever fragile magic is guiding us through the darkness. So I walk behind him in silence, watching the play of lantern light across tree trunks and fallen leaves, trying to memorize the path in case I need to find my way back alone. But deep down, I'm beginning to suspect that there will be no going back the way I came. That this stranger with his steady light and unhurried pace is leading me not just out of the physical woods, but towards something I didn't even know I was looking for. Something that might change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. To understand why that night in the woods felt like stepping through a door I'd been searching for without knowing it, you have to understand what my life looked like before I followed a stranger's lantern deeper into the darkness. I was 21 and drifting through my second year at the state university, studying environmental science because it sounded meaningful when I filled out my college applications. Back then, I imagined myself as someone who would save forests, protect watersheds, make a difference in a world that seemed to be burning down around us. But sitting in lecture halls listening to professors drone about soil composition and carbon cycles, I felt more like I was studying the autopsy of a planet rather than learning how to heal it. My apartment sat 3 blocks from campus, a cramped 2-bedroom that I shared with Zachary and Miles. We'd been randomly assigned as roommates freshman year and stayed together out of convenience rather than any deep friendship. Zachary was pre-med, the kind of person who had his entire life mapped out in 5-year increments. His side of our shared living room was organized with military precision. Textbooks arranged by subject, color-coded planners, a corkboard covered with acceptance letters to summer programs I couldn't afford to apply for. Miles studied business and treated college like an extended networking event. He knew everyone and remembered their names, their majors, their hometowns. He threw parties in our living room every few weeks, filling our small space with people who laughed too loud and drank too much and left sticky rings on our coffee table. I would retreat to my room during these gatherings, telling them I had studying to do, listening to the bass thump through our thin walls until the early hours of morning. They weren't bad people. In fact, they were probably exactly the kind of friends I was supposed to have. Zachary would quiz me before exams, even though we weren't in any of the same classes. Miles always invited me to join their weekend adventures, never seeming to take it personally when I declined. They included me in their conversations about girls they were dating, jobs they wanted, places they planned to travel after graduation. But I felt like I was watching their lives through glass. They moved through the world with a confidence I couldn't imagine possessing, making decisions that seemed to come naturally while I second-guessed every choice I made. They talked about their futures the way other people talked about the weather, casual and certain. Zachary would be a doctor. Miles would work in marketing or maybe start his own company. These weren't dreams or hopes, but simple facts, as inevitable as sunrise. When they asked about my plans, I would mumble something about graduate school or research positions, but the words felt hollow in my mouth. The truth was, I had no idea what I wanted to do after college. The environmental science program that had once excited me now felt like an academic exercise, disconnected from any real purpose. I went through the motions of being a good student, turning in assignments and showing up for labs, but my heart wasn't in it. My parents called every Sunday, and I lied to them with increasing skill. Yes, I was doing well in my classes. Yes, I was making friends. Yes, I was thinking about internships for next summer. They wanted to hear that I was thriving, building the foundation for a stable, respectable life. My father, who worked in insurance and had never missed a day of work in 20 years, would talk about the importance of staying focused. My mother would ask about girls I was dating, her voice carrying just a hint of worry when I told her I was too busy with school for relationships. I couldn't explain to them that I felt like someone pretending to be their son, that every conversation required me to perform a version of myself that grew more exhausting to maintain. They had sacrificed to send me to college, working extra hours and postponing their own dreams so I could have opportunities they never had. The weight of their expectations sat on my chest like a stone. The woods where I got lost that night were part of a state forest that bordered the university grounds. I had discovered them early in my freshman year, when the noise and energy of dorm life became too much to bear. At first, I just walked the marked trails, grateful for an hour or two of silence. But over time, I ventured deeper, following deer paths and stream beds, learning the geography of that wild place. It became my refuge from the constant pressure to be someone I wasn't sure I could become. In the woods, I didn't have to pretend to care about career fairs or networking events. I didn't have to smile and nod when Zachary talked about the prestige of different medical schools or when Miles analyzed which internships would look best on his resume. Among the trees, I could just be quiet and still, listening to the sound of my own thoughts without the static of other people's certainties drowning them out. But that night, walking away from the bonfire and my friends' laughter, I wasn't looking for refuge. I was running from something I couldn't name, fleeing a life that felt like it belonged to someone else. The woods that had always welcomed me seemed different in the darkness, less like sanctuary and more like mirror, reflecting back all the ways I felt lost even when I knew exactly where I was. That's what I was carrying with me when the stranger with the lantern appeared. Not just the immediate panic of being physically lost, but the deeper disorientation of a young man who had spent 2 years trying to build a life that felt like wearing clothes that didn't fit. Every step I took following his light was a step away from the version of myself I had been failing to become, towards something I couldn't yet see but somehow recognize. The path he led me on that night was just the beginning. But to understand why I was ready to follow, you had to know how thoroughly I had already lost my way. The cabin materialized out of the darkness like something from a half-remembered dream. One moment, we were climbing through dense pine forest, the lantern light catching on bark and stone, and the next we stepped into a small clearing where a structure sat nestled between towering trees. It was modest, weathered by years of mountain winters, its log walls silvered by moonlight. Smoke curled from a stone chimney, and warm yellow light glowed in 2 small windows, promising shelter from the cold that had begun to seep through my jacket and into my bones. He led me up 3 wooden steps to a covered porch and pushed open the door without ceremony. The interior was exactly what I expected and nothing like I had imagined. A single room with a stone fireplace along one wall, its hearth crackling with split pine that filled the space with the scent of resin and smoke. A small kitchen occupied the far corner, just a wood-burning stove, open shelves lined with mason jars, and a hand-pumped well. Everything was simple, functional, worn smooth by use rather than age. But it was the details that caught my attention. Books stacked on every available surface, their spines cracked and pages softened by countless readings. A guitar leaning against the wall near the fireplace, its wood polished to a honey glow. Bundles of herbs hanging from the rafters, filling the air with the scent of sage and lavender. This wasn't just shelter. This was a home shaped by someone who had chosen to live deliberately, carefully outside the structures I'd been taught were necessary. He set the lantern on a wooden table and turned to look at me properly for the first time. In the firelight, I could see that he was perhaps 24, maybe 25, with dark hair that curled at his collar and eyes the color of deep water. There was something timeless about his face, as if he could have stepped out of an old photograph or painting. His clothes were practical, well-made, the kind that last for years rather than seasons. He told me his name was Rowan, and his voice carried the same unhurried quality as his movements. He asked if I was hurt, if I needed anything immediate, and when I shook my head, he simply nodded and moved to the kitchen. I stood awkwardly near the door, suddenly aware of how out of place I must look in his carefully ordered space, my university sweatshirt and hiking boots marking me as clearly as a uniform. But he showed no sign of judgment, only quiet efficiency as he filled a kettle from the hand pump and set on the wood stove. He moved around the small space with the kind of grace that comes from knowing every inch of your environment, never having to think about where things were or how they worked. It was the opposite of how I felt in my own apartment, where I was always searching for things I had misplaced, always feeling like a visitor in my own life. While the water heated, he gestured for me to sit at the table and asked how I had come to be lost in the woods at night. I found myself telling him about the bonfire, about walking away from my friends, about taking what I thought was a familiar trail and finding myself somewhere I had never been before. But as I spoke, I realized I was describing more than just getting turned around in the forest. I was talking about a deeper kind of lostness, the way I had been drifting through my life without direction or purpose. He listened without interruption, his attention complete but never demanding. Most people, when you tell them you're lost, immediately start offering solutions, directions, reassurances that everything will be fine. Rowan simply heard what I was saying, as if my confusion were something worth understanding rather than something to be quickly fixed. When the kettle whistled, he made tea in 2 ceramic mugs, adding honey from a jar that looked homemade. The tea was unlike anything I had tasted before, earthy and complex, made from herbs I couldn't identify. It warmed me from the inside, loosening muscles I hadn't realized I was holding tense. We sat in comfortable silence for a while, the fire crackling in the background, the wind moving through the pines outside. I found myself studying his hands wrapped around his mug, noting the calluses that spoke of physical work, the way he held the cup as if he had all the time in the world to drink it. Everything about him suggested a different relationship with time, with urgency, with a constant pressure to be moving towards some predetermined goal. Eventually, I asked him about the cabin, about how long he had lived here. He told me he had built it himself 3 years ago, after deciding that the life he had been living in town wasn't the life he wanted to keep living. He spoke about it matter-of-factly, as if walking away from conventional expectations were no more dramatic than changing the channel on a television. I wanted to ask him what he had walked away from, what kind of life he had left behind to build this quiet existence in the woods. But something about his manner discouraged probing questions. Instead, I found myself asking different things, questions I hadn't known I was carrying. What did it mean to choose a life outside the structures everyone else took for granted? How did you know if you were following your own path, or just running away from the path others had chosen for you? He didn't answer directly, the way my professors would have, with definitions and frameworks and clear explanations. Instead, he told me to listen, not to him, but to the sounds around us. The fire shifting in the grate, the wind in the trees, the settling of old wood. My own heartbeat, steady and sure beneath my ribs. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt myself becoming still. Not the forced stillness of trying to pay attention in a lecture hall, but a deeper quiet, the kind that comes when you stop running from yourself long enough to notice that you're exactly where you need to be. The night stretched on, and neither of us mentioned that I should probably be getting back to campus, back to my roommates who might be wondering where I was. Instead, Rowan showed me where I could sleep, a narrow bed near the fireplace with quilts that smelled like cedar and wood smoke. As I lay there listening to the fire die down to embers, I realized that for the first time in 2 years of college, I felt like I was somewhere I belonged. I told myself I wouldn't go back. The next morning, Rowan had shown me the path to the main trail, pointing out landmarks I should remember so I wouldn't get lost again. He gave me directions that led back to the road, back to campus, back to the life I had temporarily stepped away from. We didn't exchange phone numbers or make plans to meet again. He simply watched me disappear into the trees with the same quiet attention he gave everything else, as if my leaving were as natural as my arriving had been. But 3 days later, I found myself walking those same trails again, this time in daylight, carrying a thermos of coffee and the excuse that I wanted to thank him properly for helping me. Zachary had asked where I'd been that night, and I'd mumbled something about getting turned around and sleeping in my car. Miles had ribbed me about missing the best part of the party, when someone had convinced Professor Chun to join them for beer pong. I'd smiled and nodded and felt like I was watching their lives through that same pane of glass, more distant than ever. The cabin looked different in afternoon sunlight, less mysterious, but somehow more real. Rowan was splitting wood behind the house, his axe falling in steady rhythm against rounds of pine. He looked up when I approached, but showed no surprise, as if he had been expecting me. He set down the axe and accepted the coffee I offered, and we sat on the porch steps drinking it while late October sun filtered through the canopy above us. That became the pattern. Every few days, I would invent reasons to visit. I told my roommates I had discovered a good study spot in the woods, that I was working on a field research project for one of my environmental science classes. The lies came easily, perhaps because they felt more true than anything else I was saying about my life. With Rowan, I helped stack the wood we split, learning to read the grain and find the natural fault lines that would make the work easier. He showed me how to bank the fire so it would burn through the night, how to read weather patterns in the movement of clouds across the mountain peaks. We would sit by the fire as rain drummed against the roof, and he would ask me questions that had no right answers. What did I want from my life? Not what I thought I should want, or what would make my parents proud, or what would look good on a resume. What did I actually want in the quiet space behind all those expectations? The question followed me back to campus like smoke clinging to my clothes. I would sit in lectures on watershed management or soil chemistry, taking dutiful notes, but my mind would drift back to Rowan's kitchen, to the way he moved through his daily routines with such deliberate care. There was something almost sacred about the way he made tea, the attention he paid to every small task. It made my own life feel careless by comparison, rushed and thoughtless. My grades didn't suffer, but my engagement did. I went through the motions of being a student while feeling increasingly disconnected from the academic world around me. During study sessions with classmates, I would find myself thinking about the rhythm of splitting wood, the satisfaction of physical work that produced something tangible and necessary. In dining halls full of students planning their futures with spreadsheet precision, I would remember the quiet of Rowan's cabin, the way time moved differently there. Sometimes, when we worked together or sat by the fire, I would catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite interpret. Not judgment, but a kind of careful attention, as if he were seeing something about me that I hadn't yet recognized myself. In those moments, the air between us would feel charged with possibility, heavy with things neither of us was saying. I began to notice details about him that I hadn't seen before. The way his hands moved when he talked, graceful and sure. The way he laughed, which was rare but never forced. The way he listened, not just to words but to the spaces between them. He had a scar along his left forearm that looked old, and I found myself wondering about the story behind it. But asking felt too intimate, too much like crossing a line I wasn't sure I was ready to cross. One evening, as we sat watching the fire burn low, I asked him what he had done before building the cabin. For a long moment, he was quiet, and I thought he might not answer. Then he told me he had been a graduate student, studying forestry at a university not unlike mine. He had been on track for a PhD, following a path that would have led to a respectable academic career, maybe a position with the Forest Service or a research institution. But the closer he got to that future, the more it felt like wearing someone else's skin. He would sit in seminars discussing forest management as if trees were resources to be optimized rather than living beings with their own ancient wisdom. He would write papers about ecological systems while feeling increasingly disconnected from the actual forest just outside his laboratory window. So he left, not dramatically, not in anger, but quietly, the way someone might close a book they've decided they don't want to finish reading. He came to these mountains, bought this piece of land, and built a life that made sense to him in ways his previous life never had. As he spoke, I felt something shift inside my chest, like a door I hadn't known was locked finally turning open. Here was someone who had walked away from the kind of future I was supposed to want, who had chosen uncertainty over security, authenticity over approval. And he seemed not diminished by that choice, but enlarged by it, more fully himself than anyone I had ever met. The implications of his story settled over me slowly, like snow accumulating on branches. If he could choose a different path, what did that mean for the path I was on? What did it mean for the life I was trying so hard to build, the version of myself I was trying so hard to become? That night, walking back to campus under a sky brilliant with stars, I carried his story with me like a seed that had been planted in soil I hadn't known was ready to receive it. The revelation came on a night when the temperature dropped below freezing for the first time that season. I had stayed later than usual, helping Rowan prepare the cabin for winter, sealing gaps in the chinking between logs, bringing in the last of the firewood from the stack outside. The work was physical and satisfying in ways that sitting in lecture halls could never be, and I found myself reluctant to leave for the walk back to campus. The fire had burned down to embers, casting the room in amber shadows that seemed to breathe with the settling of old wood. We sat at the table with the remnants of dinner between us, 2 bowls that had held stew made from vegetables he'd grown himself and herbs he'd gathered from the mountainside. The silence between us was comfortable, but underneath it ran something else, a current I had been feeling for weeks but hadn't dared to name. Rowan was reading, his attention absorbed by a book of poetry I didn't recognize. The lamplight caught the angles of his face, the line of his jaw, the way his dark hair fell across his forehead when he bent over the page. I had been watching him read for the better part of an hour, and only gradually did I become aware that my attention had shifted from casual observation to something deeper, more intentional. There was beauty in the way he held the book, in the careful way he turned each page, in the small smile that would sometimes touch his lips when he encountered a line that pleased him. But it wasn't just aesthetic appreciation I was feeling. It was something warmer, more personal, something that made my chest tight and my pulse quicken. He looked up suddenly and caught me staring. For a moment, neither of us moved, and I felt exposed in a way that had nothing to do with the lamplight. His eyes held mine with an intensity that seemed to see right through all the careful walls I had built around myself. I should have looked away, should have made some casual comment about how late it was getting. Instead, I found myself unable to break the connection, drawn into the stillness like a moth to flame. He closed the book and set it aside, the small sound unnaturally loud in the quiet room. When he spoke, his voice was softer than usual, careful in a way that suggested he was choosing his words deliberately. He asked if I knew why I kept coming back to the cabin. Not the reasons I told myself, about thanking him or helping with chores or escaping the noise of campus life. The real reason, the one I hadn't been willing to examine too closely. I opened my mouth to give him one of my usual deflections, something about finding peace in the woods or enjoying the physical work. But under his steady gaze, the words died in my throat. Because the truth was, I came back for him. For the way he listened without judgment, for the way he moved through the world with such quiet certainty, for the way he made me feel like someone worth paying attention to. And for something else, something I had been afraid to acknowledge even to myself. He moved closer then, not dramatically, but with the same deliberate grace he brought to everything else. One moment, there was the comfortable distance of friendship between us, and the next he was close enough that I could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth radiating from his skin. I whispered something, half question and half plea, words that barely made sense, but somehow conveyed everything I'd been feeling and couldn't say. He didn't answer with words. Instead, he reached out and brushed his fingers against the back of my hand where it lay on the table between us. The contact was brief, lighter than a breath, but it felt like electricity running along my nerves. My hand turned almost without conscious thought, palm up, and his fingers traced the lines there with a touch so gentle it was barely contact at all. But it was enough to confirm what I had been trying not to understand about myself, about the way my pulse raced when he looked at me, about the dreams I'd been having that left me confused and wanting. Time seemed to slow, the way it does in moments that feel too significant to rush through. The fire shifted in the grate, sending shadows dancing across the walls. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant ocean waves. But all of that faded into background noise as I stared down at our hands, his fingers dark against my pale skin, the simple contact somehow more intimate than anything I had ever experienced. When I finally looked up, he was watching my face with an expression I couldn't read, but felt in my bones. There was question in his eyes, and patience, and something that might have been hope. No pressure, no demand, just an invitation to acknowledge what was happening between us. I pulled my hand back, not in rejection, but in sudden need for space to think, to breathe, to process what I was feeling. He let me go without resistance, settling back in his chair with the same calm acceptance he brought to everything else. But the air between us remained changed, charged with possibility and confession. Later, walking back to campus through the cold mountain night, I caught my reflection in the dark window of a building and barely recognized myself. My face looked different, older somehow, as if something fundamental had shifted in the space of that single touch. I thought about Zachary and Miles, probably asleep in our shared apartment, dreaming their uncomplicated dreams about medical school and business careers and girls they would marry and lives they would build according to plans they had never questioned. I thought about my parents, who called every Sunday to check on my progress toward a future they had helped design. And I thought about Rowan, alone in his cabin with his books and his fire and his deliberate solitude, who had somehow seen something in me that I was only just beginning to see in myself. The truth I couldn't escape, walking through the darkness toward a life that no longer felt like it fit, was that I wanted to go back. Not just to the cabin, but to that moment when his fingers touched mine and the world rearranged itself around a possibility I had never allowed myself to imagine. The weight of choice pressed down on me like stone in the days that followed. I would sit in my environmental science classes, ostensibly taking notes on ecosystem management, but my pen would trace meaningless patterns in the margins while my mind replayed that moment at the cabin. The brush of Rowan's fingers against mine had unlocked something I couldn't force back into hiding, a truth that colored everything I looked at with different light. At night, lying in my narrow dorm bed, while Zachary studied late into the evening and Miles talked loudly on the phone with whatever girl had caught his attention that week, I would stare at the ceiling and try to imagine explaining to them what I was feeling. The words wouldn't come. How could I tell them that touching another man's hand had felt more real than anything I had experienced in 2 years of college? How could I make them understand that I was questioning not just my future plans, but the fundamental assumptions about who I was supposed to become? My absences became harder to explain. 3 days would pass without me visiting the cabin, then 4, as I tried to convince myself I could return to the life I had been living before. But the conversations with my roommates felt increasingly hollow. When Zachary talked about his summer research position at the medical center, I would nod and offer the appropriate encouragement while feeling like I was watching someone else's life unfold. When Miles described his internship interviews, his confidence about stepping into the business world after graduation, I felt the familiar sensation of observing from behind glass. My mother called on a Tuesday evening, her voice bright, with the kind of forced cheerfulness she used when she was worried but tried not to show it. She had spoken with my academic advisor. She said, just to check on how I was doing. Dr. Peterson had mentioned that I seemed distracted lately, less engaged in class discussions than usual. Was everything all right? Was I feeling overwhelmed by the coursework? Maybe I should consider tutoring or reducing my course load, or talking to someone in the counseling center about stress management. I sat on my bed, phone pressed to my ear, and lied with practiced ease. Everything was fine. I was just focusing more on independent study, spending time in the library, really diving deep into my environmental research. She seemed satisfied with this explanation. Moving on to news about my father's promotion at work, my sister's upcoming graduation from high school, the renovations they were planning for the kitchen. But after I hung up, I felt the familiar tightness in my chest that came from maintaining a performance I was no longer sure I could sustain. They were all so invested in the version of me I had been pretending to be. My parents had sacrificed for my education, working extra shifts and postponing their own dreams so I could have opportunities they never had. My sister looked up to me as the responsible older brother who was building a successful future. My roommates included me in their plans because they saw me as someone like them, someone headed toward the same conventional markers of achievement. None of them knew about the cabin in the woods, about Rowan, about the questions that were reshaping everything I thought I understood about myself. A week passed before I finally returned to the forest. I told myself I was going to end it, whatever it was that had started between us. I would thank Rowan for his friendship, tell him I needed to focus on my studies, make it clear that I couldn't keep disappearing from my real life to play house in the wilderness. But when I reached the cabin, I found him chopping kindling behind the house, his movements precise and economical. He looked up when I approached, and his face showed neither surprise nor judgment, just the same quiet acceptance he brought to everything else. He set down the axe and asked if I wanted coffee, as if a week hadn't passed since my last visit, as if nothing had changed between us. We sat on the porch steps in the late afternoon sun, and I tried to form the words that would create distance between us. But instead, I found myself talking about my parents, about their expectations, about the life they had imagined for me. I talked about my roommates, about the ease with which they moved toward futures that seemed predetermined. I talked about feeling like someone wearing a costume that didn't fit, playing a role in someone else's story. Rowan listened without offering solutions or reassurances. When I finally ran out of words, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he asked me a question that cut through all my carefully constructed rationalizations. What did I want? Not what would make other people happy, not what would fulfill their expectations or justify their sacrifices. What did I actually want for my own life? The question hung in the air between us like smoke. I wanted to give him an answer, but the truth was I had spent so long trying to want the right things that I had lost track of my own desires. I knew what I was supposed to want: a degree, a career, a life that would make my parents proud and justify their investment in my education. But sitting there beside him, I couldn't pretend those wants felt authentic anymore. Instead, I found myself talking about smaller things. The satisfaction of splitting wood, the way tea tasted when it was made from herbs you had gathered yourself, the particular quality of silence that existed only in places untouched by human noise. I talked about the feeling of time moving differently here without the constant pressure to be productive, to be building towards something, to be becoming someone other than who I was in this moment. As I spoke, I realized I was describing not just what I enjoyed about visiting the cabin, but what I wanted from my life. Not the grand ambitions my parents dreamed of, but something quieter, more deliberate, more true. Rowan didn't tell me what to do. He never pressured me or suggested that I should abandon my education or disappoint my family. But when our conversation ended and the sun had set behind the mountains, when it was time for me to walk back to campus and the life that was waiting for me there, he said something that lodged itself in my chest like a splinter. He said he couldn't tell me what choice to make, but he could tell me that the person I was when I sat on his porch was the person he hoped would keep coming back. The decision, when it finally came, wasn't dramatic. There was no moment of sudden clarity, no bolt of lightning illuminating the correct path forward. Instead, it emerged slowly like dawn breaking over the mountains, inevitable and quiet and true. I had returned to campus after that last conversation with Rowan, carrying his words about the person I was on his porch like a talisman against the noise of my everyday life. For 3 days, I went through the motions of being a student. I attended lectures, turned in assignments, nodded at appropriate moments during study sessions with classmates. But underneath the performance, something had shifted irrevocably. The breaking point came during a career fair on a Thursday afternoon. The gymnasium was filled with recruiters from environmental consulting firms, government agencies, graduate programs, all offering versions of the future I was supposed to want. I walked from booth to booth collecting brochures and business cards, smiling and shaking hands, and asking the questions I had been coached to ask about internship opportunities and career advancement. But as I stood in that crowded space, surrounded by the loud enthusiasm of students planning their ascent into professional respectability, I felt like I was drowning. The air itself seemed thin, insufficient. Every conversation about 5-year plans and salary expectations and networking strategies felt like another weight added to my chest, pressing down until I could barely breathe. I left the career fair early, claiming I felt sick, which wasn't entirely a lie. Back in my apartment, I sat on my bed and stared at the pile of brochures I had collected. Graduate school applications, environmental consulting positions, research opportunities that would look impressive on a resume. All the pieces of a life that would make my parents proud, that would justify their sacrifices, that would prove I was becoming the person they had worked so hard to help me become. But none of it felt like mine. That night, Zachary found me packing a backpack in our shared room. He assumed I was going on one of my study trips to the woods, and I didn't correct him. Miles, cooking dinner in the kitchen, called out to ask if I wanted him to save me leftovers for when I got back tomorrow. I told him not to worry about it, that I might be gone longer than usual. They were good friends in their way. They included me in their plans, tolerated my increasingly frequent absences, never questioned my explanations, even when they grew thin. They deserved better than the lies I'd been telling them, but I couldn't find words for the truth. How could I explain that I was leaving not just for the weekend, but potentially forever? How could I make them understand that the future we had all been working toward felt like a coat that would never fit properly, no matter how long I wore it? The walk to the cabin took longer than usual because I stopped frequently, partly from the weight of the backpack, but mostly from the magnitude of what I was doing. Each step took me further from the life I had been building and closer to something unknown, untested, terrifying in its uncertainty. I thought about my parents probably sitting down to dinner about now, talking about their days, maybe mentioning me in passing, proud of their son who was doing well in college, who was on track to build something stable and respectable. I thought about my sister, who would be starting her own college application soon, who looked up to me as an example of how to navigate the transition into adulthood successfully. But I also thought about the feeling of splitting wood beside Rowan, the satisfaction of physical work that produced something tangible and necessary. I thought about conversations that meandered toward truth instead of racing toward predetermined conclusions. I thought about the person I was when I sat on his porch, watching the light change through the trees, feeling for the first time like someone who belonged in his own skin. The cabin appeared through the trees, just as the last light was fading from the sky. Smoke rose from the chimney, and warm light glowed in the windows, promising sanctuary from more than just the cold. I stood at the edge of the clearing for a long moment, backpack heavy on my shoulders, knowing that once I crossed this threshold, there would be no pretending this was just another visit. Rowan opened the door before I knocked, as if he had been listening for my footsteps on the path. He looked at the backpack and my face, and his expression didn't change, but something in his eyes suggested he understood what my presence meant. He stepped aside to let me in, and I crossed into the warmth and quiet of the cabin, into the life I had been afraid to choose. We didn't talk about what my being there meant, at least not immediately. Instead, he made tea while I sat at the familiar table, feeling my breathing slowly return to normal for the first time in days. Outside, wind moved through the pines with a sound like distant music, and the fire crackled in the grate, filling the space between us with something that wasn't quite silence, but wasn't quite conversation either. Later, much later, as we sat watching the flames die down to embers, he asked if I was sure about this choice. Not the practical questions about my education or my family or my future prospects, but whether I was choosing this life because it was what I wanted or because I was running away from something else. I thought about it for a long time before answering. Both, I told him. But sometimes running away from the wrong thing is the same as running toward the right thing. He nodded as if this made perfect sense, and maybe it did. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through windows I had never seen at dawn before, in a bed that smelled like cedar and wood smoke instead of industrial detergent. Through the glass, I could see mountains rising into a sky so clear it looked like something from a photograph. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of Rowan moving quietly in the kitchen, to the birds beginning their morning conversations in the trees outside. For the first time in months, maybe years, I felt no urgency to be anywhere else, to become anyone other than exactly who I was in that moment. Eventually, I got up and joined him for coffee on the porch, watching the forest wake up around us. We didn't talk about the future, about what would happen next, about how I would explain my absence to the people who would eventually notice I was gone. Instead, we sat in comfortable silence, breathing the clean mountain air, letting the morning unfold around us without trying to shape it into something else. For now, that was enough.